On the morning of March 6, 1944, Berlin's air raid sirens wailed once more. Citizens expected the distant drone of bombers, but what they saw instead was unprecedented: sleek silver fighters racing above the city. The American P-51 Mustang had arrived. For the first time, Allied escort fighters had flown from England to the heart of the Reich and back without refueling. Until that day, German commanders believed Berlin lay beyond the reach of enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe's strategy depended on that distance. It allowed interceptors to strike bombers once their escorts turned home, but the Mustang's appearance over the capital shattered that calculation in an instant. Equipped with the rolls-royce Merlin engine and armed with 6 heavy machine guns, the new fighter could match the Me-109 in speed, outclimb the FW-190, and still fly over 1,000 miles. When the first Mustang swept across the skies of Brandenburg, disbelief spread through German command posts. Reports called it impossible, yet the wreckage on the fields around Oranienburg proved otherwise. That day marked a turning point in the air war. The Allies had crossed the final frontier. The Luftwaffe had lost its last sanctuary, and the skies above Germany would never be the same again. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a critical impasse. The 8th Air Force carried out daylight bombing raids against Germany with determination, but at a staggering cost. Without a long-range escort, B-17S and B-24S faced interception deep inside enemy territory. Each mile beyond the Dutch border increased the odds of disaster. The Luftwaffe's fighter groups, JG-2, JG-26, and JG-54 ruled the skies over occupied Europe. German aces like Adolf Galland and Egon Mayer led attacks that tore through bomber formations. In October 1943, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission ended in disaster. 60 bombers lost and more than 600 crewmen killed or missing. Those losses forced American commanders to admit a painful truth: their bombers could not reach the heart of Germany without protection. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the British Spitfire were powerful at medium range, but both lacked endurance. Auxiliary tanks extended their reach only marginally, leaving the bomber streams exposed once they crossed the Rhine. The Luftwaffe exploited that gap, waiting for the moment when the escorts turned back. Above central Germany, the bomber crews were always alone. Factories in Britain and the United States searched urgently for a solution. Engineers tested heavier fuel loads, redesigned wings, and experimented with new engines. None achieved the balance of speed, range, and firepower required. The Allies needed a fighter that could fly to Berlin, fight, and return, a demand that pushed the limits of wartime design. Germany still appeared formidable. Its aircraft industry produced hundreds of Me-109S and FW-190S each month, supported by synthetic fuel plants and dispersed repair centers. Despite Allied bombing, the Reich maintained its grip on the skies through superior organization and the experience of its pilots. Many believed that dominance would last for years. Yet, on a few quiet airfields in England, a new fighter began to arrive, sleek, efficient, and unlike any the Americans had flown before. The P-51 Mustang had first been built for Britain, but its early Allison engines struggled at high altitude. That weakness changed in 1943 when British engineers installed the rolls-royce Merlin engine into the Mustang's streamlined frame. The transformation was immediate. With far greater climb rate and range exceeding 1,000 miles, the Mustang became the aircraft the Allies had waited for. By winter, test flights confirmed what commanders dared to hope: the Mustang could escort bombers to the farthest German targets. Its arrival promised to erase the Luftwaffe's last strategic advantage: distance. The calm before the storm was ending. Within months, the Allied bombers would no longer fly unprotected, and the skies above the Reich would become the new battlefield that would decide the fate of Europe. The P-51 Mustang's path to Berlin began years before its engines ever roared over Europe. In 1940, as Britain faced isolation, the Royal Air Force sought new aircraft to counter German power. North American aviation, led by James Dutch Kindleberger and designer Edgar Schmood, proposed an entirely new fighter instead of licensing an older British model. The prototype NA-73X flew just 4 months later, fast, stable, and efficient at low altitude. Yet the Allison engine limited its high-altitude performance, keeping it in secondary roles for reconnaissance and low-level attack. In 1942, British engineers at Rolls-Royce made a bold change. They fitted the Mustang airframe with the Merlin 61 engine, the same one powering the Spitfire Mk9. The difference was dramatic. The aircraft climbed faster, flew higher, and reached nearly double the range of its predecessors. With its laminar flow wing and large internal fuel capacity, the new P-51B could fly beyond 1,600 kilometers without auxiliary tanks. When drop tanks were added, its reach extended deep into Germany. Among those who recognized its potential was Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, the U.S. Air Attaché in London. He urged Generals Henry Hap Arnold and Ira Eaker to adopt the Merlin-powered Mustang for long-range escort. The idea fit perfectly with General James Doolittle's doctrine: destroy the Luftwaffe, not by defense, but through relentless attack. Doolittle understood that victory in Europe required complete control of the air, and to gain that, the Allies needed a fighter that could accompany bombers to any target inside the Reich. By late 1943, the first Mustang groups arrived in England. The 354th and 357th Fighter Groups began training for extended-range operations, learning tactics that would define a new kind of air war. Unlike earlier escorts, Mustang pilots were encouraged to engage aggressively, breaking formation when necessary to strike German interceptors before they reached the bombers. The Mustang's speed, over 430 miles per hour, and its service ceiling of 42,000 feet gave them unmatched flexibility. Its 6 Browning .50 caliber guns, carrying nearly 1,800 rounds, ensured lethal endurance in combat. German pilots first encountered the new fighter late that year. Reports described a long-winged aircraft of unfamiliar type that could dive as fast as a Thunderbolt and climb almost like a Spitfire. Intelligence officers initially dismissed it as an experimental model, but repeated sightings and growing losses forced Luftwaffe command to take notice. The balance that had once favored German interceptors was beginning to tilt. Strategically, the timing could not have been worse for Germany. The Allies were preparing a massive aerial campaign for early 1944, Operation Argument, later known as Big Week. The goal was to cripple the Luftwaffe's industrial base and destroy its fighters faster than they could be replaced. Success depended on one condition: bombers had to survive long enough to reach their targets. In December 1943, the first P-51B missions began under the 8th Air Force. Pilots immediately recognized what they had. You could fly to Berlin, fight, and still get home, one recalled. For airmen who had endured the slaughter of Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the change felt revolutionary. Now the bombers could count on escort all the way to the target and back. As 1944 began, preparations for Big Week intensified. The 8th Air Force would send waves of B-17S and B-24S against Germany's aircraft factories and ball-bearing plants, while the new Mustangs hunted the interceptors sent to defend them. The Luftwaffe expected another routine battle. It did not yet realize that its advantage of range had vanished forever. When the first Mustangs lifted off from the frozen runways of England that February, their pilots carried more than new machines. They carried the decisive weapon of the European air war. What began as an experimental British-American hybrid was now the key to Allied air supremacy. In the months ahead, the Mustang would not only reach Berlin, but would break the Luftwaffe's hold on the continent, ending the myth that Germany's skies could never be breached. On February 20, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, later called Big Week. It was the largest coordinated air offensive the Allies had yet attempted. Each morning, hundreds of B-17S and B-24S lifted off from England, escorted by new formations of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. Their orders were simple but absolute: destroy Germany's aircraft production at its source and force the Luftwaffe into battle until it broke. From the first day, the scale of the assault stunned both sides. Radar stations along the Dutch coast tracked massive bomber streams stretching for miles. German interceptors scrambled from bases at Münster, Braunschweig, and Magdeburg, expecting the usual withdrawal of Allied escorts near the Rhine. But this time, the fighters did not turn back. The Mustangs kept climbing, staying with the bombers across the German frontier. When Me-109 rose to attack, they found Allied fighters already waiting above them. The first major clash unfolded near Brunswick. Major James Goodson's squadron dove from high altitude, scattering a formation of Me-109Gs. Within minutes, 7 were downed. Similar engagements erupted across Saxony and Thuringia. Instead of striking defenseless bombers, the Luftwaffe found itself trapped in a series of furious dogfights against faster, longer-enduring opponents. Communications broke down as ground controllers struggled to coordinate intercepts under heavy interference. The air above Germany became a shifting web of contrails, smoke, and falling debris. By the end of the second day, Allied bomber losses remained high but sustainable. For the first time, the Luftwaffe suffered heavier casualties than its opponents. On February 22nd, bombers struck Regensburg and Schweinfurt once again, sites still recovering from earlier raids. This time, Mustang escorts circled above the target for 20 minutes after the last bombs fell, shooting down interceptors as they climbed to engage. German pilots, once confident in their advantage, now reported exhaustion and confusion. Big Week lasted 6 days. By its conclusion, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 600 aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable veterans. Allied airmen sensed the shift immediately. The bomber crews who once endured unopposed attacks now saw their escorts chasing German fighters away from the formations. Commanders at High Wycombe declared that the balance of air power had finally changed. Yet the campaign's true turning point came 2 weeks later, over Berlin itself. At dawn on March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched 500 B-17S toward the German capital. They were escorted by nearly 700 fighters, including over 100 P-51 Mustangs. The mission's objective was both tactical and psychological, to prove that the Allies could strike Berlin in daylight and survive. As the formations crossed the Rhine, German radar stations detected them and relayed urgent alerts to interceptor bases. Controllers expected the escort to turn back as always. But when the reports came that the fighters remained with the bombers past Hanover, disbelief spread through command posts. "They are still with them," one operator reported. "They have not turned." Over Wittenberg, Jagdgeschwader 26 and 54 engaged head-on. Me-109S and W-190S slashed through the bomber streams, only to be met by Mustangs diving from above. Lieutenant Don Gentile's squadron alone claimed a dozen victories in a single engagement. Witnesses described the sky as a storm of silver and fire, filled with spinning aircraft and black smoke trails. Over Brandenburg, American fighters pursued German planes to the treetops, leaving burning wrecks across the countryside. By noon, the first wave of B-17S reached Berlin. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire from the massive flak towers at Humboldthain and Friedrichshain, filling the air with explosions. Despite heavy losses, the bombers dropped their loads on railway yards and industrial districts. Below, Berliners watched in disbelief as American escort fighters, symbols of a war once thought distant, streaked across the city's sky. At Luftwaffe headquarters, officers struggled to comprehend how enemy fighters had crossed 1,000 kilometers of defended airspace. The battle lasted nearly 6 hours. 69 bombers were lost, but the Luftwaffe paid a higher price. More than 100 fighters destroyed and dozens of senior pilots killed. For the first time since 1939, German air defense had failed to protect its capital. Field Marshal Erhard Milch described the result as a catastrophe of morale. The myth of an untouchable Berlin was gone. In the following weeks, Allied momentum only increased. Mustang groups extended their reach deep into central Germany, strafing airfields, fuel depots, and railway lines. The new tactic of fighter sweeps emerged. Mustangs detached from escort duty to hunt interceptors on the ground before the bombers arrived. Airfields at Kassel, Merseburg, and Gardelegen burned under repeated attacks. The Luftwaffe's strength eroded faster than replacements could arrive. Many new recruits were barely trained, flying obsolete or hastily repaired aircraft. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. Veteran commanders watched helplessly as young pilots were lost in their first missions. What had once been a finely tuned defense network had become a fragmented, exhausted force. By April, Allied dominance was complete. The 8th and 15th Air Forces bombed Berlin, Leipzig, and Munich with reduced losses, while Mustangs roamed the skies at will. Even the appearance of the Me-262 jet fighter could not reverse the collapse. Allied patrols intercepted jets during takeoff, destroying them before they could climb. German communications referred to the situation simply as hopeless. For the Allies, the significance of Big Week and the Berlin raid was clear. They had achieved the decisive break in the air war. The Mustang's range had erased Germany's last defense, distance. From then on, no city, no factory, and no airfield in the Reich was beyond Allied reach. The day the Mustang reached Berlin marked more than a tactical success. It signaled the end of the Luftwaffe as a fighting force and the beginning of Germany's final decline. The air that had once belonged to the Reich now carried the sound of the Merlin engine echoing over a sky that Germany would never control again. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer the dominant force that had once ruled Europe's skies. Big Week and the first daylight raid on Berlin had shattered its structure, stripping it of aircraft, fuel, and experience. In 6 weeks, more than 2,000 German fighters had been destroyed, many with their most seasoned pilots still inside. What remained were hastily trained replacements flying understrength squadrons and outdated machines into a war they could no longer win. Radio intercepts confirmed the scale of the disaster. Jagdgeschwader commanders across the Reich requested reinforcements, but training schools could barely keep pace. Cadets received less than 100 flying hours before being sent into combat. Some had never fired their guns in the air. When they faced Allied Mustangs, they were outnumbered, outclimbed, and outflown. The Luftwaffe's last advantage, its cadre of veteran leaders, was vanishing day by day. Over the next months, the Mustang became both a weapon and a symbol of Allied superiority. Fighter groups such as the 4th, 352nd, and 357th conducted deep sweeps across Germany, striking airfields at Kassel, Wiesbaden, and Augsburg. Squadrons learned to attack in waves, diving on aircraft as they took off or landed. German ground crews called these raids the hunting hour. Even refueling or taxiing became a deadly risk. The destruction went beyond combat losses. By spring, the Leuna, Blechhammer, and Politz fuel refineries were burning. Synthetic gasoline production, vital to the Luftwaffe, fell by half. Many operational units had aircraft, but no fuel to fly them. Reports from field commands grew desperate. Pilots grounded for lack of fuel, interceptors abandoned for spare parts. Without aviation gasoline, Germany's once formidable air fleet was reduced to immobility. General Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters, faced the grim reality. In a private briefing, he admitted that Germany had lost air superiority, even over its own cities. "We fight with courage," he wrote, "but courage cannot fill empty tanks." High Command proposed desperate measures, rocket interceptors, hidden runways, and dispersed assembly plants, but none could reverse the collapse. Each new experiment consumed resources that no longer existed. Meanwhile, the human cost mounted on both sides. Allied bomber crews who had endured the deadly raids of 1943 finally saw their escorts arrive and stay with them to the end. Many described the sight of Mustangs diving through enemy formations as the turning of the war. Yet the victory came at a price. Even with escort cover, flak and mechanical failures continued to claim lives. By mid-1944, more than 26,000 American airmen had been killed in the European campaign. Despite the losses, morale within the Allied air forces surged. For the first time, crews returned home with fewer empty spaces in their formations. Successive missions over Frankfurt, Leipzig, and Munich proved that the Luftwaffe could no longer mount sustained resistance. The air war that had once drained Allied strength now drained Germany's capacity to fight. Strategically, the consequences reached far beyond the skies. With the Luftwaffe broken, Allied planners turned their focus to the invasion of France. Air superiority meant that supply convoys, paratroop drops, and beach assaults could proceed with minimal interference. In May and June 1944, Mustang squadrons shifted their attention to northern France, cutting rail lines and bridges in preparation for D-Day. When Allied forces landed on June 6th, German ground troops looked up and saw a sky filled entirely with Allied aircraft. Germany's production statistics told the same story. Though factories continued to build over 2,000 fighters a month, most never reached operational units. The shortage of fuel and trained pilots rendered the numbers meaningless. Entire squadrons were grounded, while others flew only a few sorties before being destroyed. Meanwhile, American production lines in California and Texas turned out new Mustangs faster than the Luftwaffe could lose them. By late summer, Allied fighters patrolled as far east as the Oder River. They attacked trains, vehicles, and troop columns retreating from France and Poland. The Luftwaffe tried to regroup with a handful of experienced aces, but their ranks were too thin to make a difference. Between February and July 1944, more than 15,000 German aircrew were lost, an irreplaceable generation wiped out in a single campaign. Inside Germany, despair replaced pride. Airfields once crowded with sleek Focke-Wulfs now stood silent. Some surviving pilots left notes before their final sorties, aware they would not return. "We have become the hunted," one lieutenant wrote in his diary. "Every flight is a farewell." The Air Force that had once carried Hitler's war across Europe now fought only to delay defeat. By year's end, the Luftwaffe existed largely in reports and propaganda. It had aircraft but no fuel, orders but no pilots. The few remaining Me-262 jets capable of outrunning the Mustang appeared too late and too few to alter events. Allied aircraft dominated every front, from the Channel coast to the Danube. The day the Mustang reached Berlin was not merely a tactical achievement, it marked the beginning of the Luftwaffe's irreversible decline. That moment transformed the strategic map of Europe, ensuring that the coming invasion and the final battles would unfold under skies that belonged entirely to the Allies. The Luftwaffe's fall had been swift, brutal, and absolute. Its fate sealed not by numbers alone, but by a single fact: the enemy could now reach everywhere, and there was nowhere left to hide. When the first Mustangs circled above Berlin in March 1944, the balance of the air war shifted permanently. From that day, the Allies no longer fought for survival in the sky, they fought from a position of control. The Luftwaffe, drained by attrition and starved of fuel, could no longer defend its own airspace. The strategic advantage that had once defined Germany's strength was gone. The effects of this reversal appeared almost immediately. With air superiority secured, Allied planning for Operation Overlord moved ahead without constraint. The Mustang's long-range coverage allowed bombers to strike transportation hubs, bridges, and fuel depots across France and Belgium in the months before D-Day. Rail traffic collapsed, leaving German reinforcements stranded. Across the Channel, Allied ground forces prepared under skies cleared of opposition. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe existed as a fraction of its former self. It still produced aircraft at record speed, but lacked pilots, fuel, and experienced leaders to use them effectively. On jet projects such as the Me-262 arrived too late and in too small numbers to alter the course of the war. Allied fighters intercepted many on takeoff, reducing the world's first operational jets to symbols of desperation rather than hope. The Mustang's dominance illustrated more than technical progress. It represented the combined industrial and scientific might of the Allied coalition. An American airframe powered by a British engine, refined through transatlantic cooperation, it embodied the wartime partnership that Germany could never match. Each Mustang leaving the factories of California or Texas demonstrated a scale of production that made recovery impossible for the Reich. For the pilots, the transformation was unmistakable. The bomber crews who had once faced the long, lonely path into Germany now flew with constant escort. Mustang formations swept ahead of the bomber streams, breaking up attacks before they began. For many airmen, the sound of the Merlin engine overhead meant survival. What had once been missions of endurance became missions of dominance. Yet victory carried a visible cost. Tens of thousands of Allied airmen had fallen to reach this point, and the wreckage of war still covered the European countryside. Even in success, few pilots saw the fight as triumph. Most described it simply as necessity, the grim work required to end the war. The Mustang's legacy was built not only on its engineering, but on the sacrifice of those who flew and maintained it under relentless conditions. By early 1945, the air war was no longer a contest. The 8th and 15th Air Forces roamed freely across the Reich. Mustang groups struck convoys, trains, and retreating columns from the Rhine to the Oder. The Luftwaffe, nearly destroyed, could only watch as Allied aircraft crossed Germany at will. Berlin, once unreachable, lay under constant observation and bombardment. Historians would later call the campaign a turning point in military strategy. It demonstrated that control of the air could decide the outcome of entire wars. The Mustang proved that technology, coordination, and range could replace numbers and geography as the defining measures of power. It turned air superiority from a tactical concept into a strategic weapon. For Germany, the day the Mustang reached Berlin marked the beginning of the end. For the Allies, it confirmed that the war in Europe would end on their terms. The flight of those long-range escorts over the Reich's capital symbolized more than a victory in the sky. It was the moment when no fortress, no border, and no empire could hide from the reach of Allied air power. When the Mustang reached Berlin, the Luftwaffe's long dominance ended. The battle for the air, once fought mile by mile across occupied Europe, had concluded above the very heart of the Reich. The sky that Germany once claimed as its fortress now carried the wings of its defeat. From that moment, the Luftwaffe fought not for victory, but for survival. The mission to Berlin proved more than a military success. It revealed the transformation of Allied air power from defense to supremacy, from endurance to control. The distance that had once protected Germany no longer existed. Every city, factory, and rail line lay within reach of Allied bombers, guided and shielded by the long-range fighter that had changed the war's direction. As spring turned to summer, those same Mustangs escorted invasion fleets across the Channel, covered paratroopers over Normandy, and swept above the advancing Allied armies through France. What began as a fight for Berlin became a march across Europe toward the end of the Third Reich. The day the Mustang appeared over Germany's capital marked a final truth. Air superiority had become total. The war on the ground was yet to be won, but the battle for the sky was over. Between late 1943 and mid-1944, the air war over Europe reached its decisive turning point. The North American P-51 Mustang, first tested with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine in Britain, entered full combat service with the 8th Air Force in December 1943. With external fuel tanks, its range exceeded 1,600 miles, enough to escort bombers from England to Berlin and back without refueling. Operation Argument, known to air crews as Big Week, began on February 20, 1944. Over 6 days, more than 3,500 B-17 and B-24 bombers, supported by 800 escort fighters, struck aircraft factories in Regensburg, Augsburg, Leipzig, and Brunswick. The Luftwaffe lost over 600 fighters, many of them veteran aircraft and pilots. Allied losses were heavy but sustainable, marking the first time the defenders suffered greater attrition than the attackers. On March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched the first daylight raid on Berlin with full escort protection. 500 B-17S and 700 fighters took part. For the Luftwaffe, the psychological impact was greater than the material loss. The enemy had reached the capital in daylight and returned unchallenged. By May, the Luftwaffe's operational strength had fallen below half its requirement. Synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Politz were bombed repeatedly, reducing aviation fuel output by 90%. Between February and July 1944, more than 15,000 German airmen were killed or captured. In total, over 15,000 Mustangs were produced during the war, destroying nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in Europe alone. After March 1944, the Luftwaffe never regained control of its own skies. The day the Mustang reached Berlin marked the irreversible collapse of German air power and the beginning of Allied dominance in Europe's air war.